I'm joined by John Barron, a British Member of Parliament and the only member of the Conservative Party to vote against taking military action in Libya. John, thanks for speaking to RT. Now, you recently put forward a motion to the House of Parliament urging the government to rule out military action in Iran. You say that move would be counterproductive. Why is that?
Well, I think it's not only naive, but it's illogical. It's naive because the policy of force has clearly failed. The policy of saber rattling and sanctions has not worked. They are yesterday's policies. Iran is not going to be deterred from pursuing its nuclear program. But it's also illogical because we're keeping an option on the table which clearly inflames the situation. People know that it would be a disaster if we pursued that option of force. It's not working. The Iranians have turned their mind against it, but at the same time it's an option that actually, as I say, inflames the situation and makes a peaceful outcome less likely.
Your motion, though, was almost unanimously rejected. Clearly people feel Iran may strike first in the region. Why shouldn't we believe that?
Well, I don't know whether they think Iran could strike first, but they feel that an option should be kept on the table because, you know, it is, I suppose, in their view, sensible that all options are left on the table, that you don't narrow your options when it comes to negotiations. I take a different view. I think by taking the option off the table, we, in the short term, reduce tensions, which is what we want. There's already talk of, perhaps over the next few months, the Israelis considering a military strike. It reduces the chances short term of a potential accident inflaming a conflict, like, for example, another shooting down of an Iran Air 655. But longer term, by taking that option off the table, it, I think, increases the chance of a peaceful outcome and perhaps gives us time to reflect on what is desperately needed here, which is a fresh approach.
But isn't Britain justified in keeping this option on the table, given Iran's defiance and aggressive rhetoric?
Well, don't forget, there's been, if you like, defiance by both sides. I mean, both sides have missed, and I'm talking about the international community here generally, both sides have missed opportunities to better relations between the two. One can think of, for example, immediately after 9/11, Iran was one of the first to actually show solidarity with the US, in contrast to many in the Middle East Street. Also in the early stages of the Afghan war, Iran made approaches. What was their reward? To be classed as part of the axis of evil by President Bush, and that led very directly to the removal of the reformist and moderate President Khatami. So I think it's fair to say there's been opportunities missed both sides, and that is why one is calling for a more balanced approach to this, because at the moment Iran is simply being painted as a sort of belligerent, difficult country to deal with, when, as I say, there's been opportunities missed on both sides.
Is there not an element of truth in that, though? They have been quite belligerent. They've had the chance to come to the negotiating table, and they haven't yet.
Yes, I would agree with that. I think they were wrong, for example, to turn their back on President Obama's initial overtures, if you like. And I don't deny that. I think, let's be absolutely clear about this. I'm not an apologist for Iran's human rights record, for their sponsoring of state terrorism overseas, for many other aspects of the regime. The point I'm making, though, is that we've got to view and judge this in a balanced way, and there have been opportunities, as I say, missed by both sides.
What has happened, though, what's developed is this almost game of brinkmanship, threat and counter-threat. So if Britain and the West does take this option of military action off the table, would that not be giving Iran the upper hand here?
Well, let's look at the facts. The policy of saber rattling and sanctions have clearly failed. I mean, if you want one example of that, Iran is now toying with, or it is actually bringing forward, the oil embargo that was imposed by the EU, certainly bringing it forward when it comes to France and the UK. I mean, I think we've got to look back and realise that the nuclear programme has been a stated objective of the Iranian state for quite a while now. We're going back decades. They see it as a means of expressing their power within the region. Status is important in the region. We underestimate the importance of status in the region. The reason Saddam Hussein, for example, did not deny the existence of WMD is because it was in his interest not to do so. So I think you have to be realistic. The present policies have failed. The present policies are heightening tensions. What we want is now to pull back from any chance of military conflict and take a fresh look at the situation and adopt a fresh approach, which I think should include an implicit recognition, or at least the offer of an implicit recognition, of Iran's status as a regional superpower.
Iran's preemption of that oil embargo and the sanctions, does that mean they've backfired somewhat on Britain and France?
I'm not sure they're backfired. You don't impose sanctions unless you know that you can see it through. I think what they do show, though, is that Iran is absolutely intent on her nuclear program, and her bringing the sanction or the deadlines forward, I think, is a clear example of that. I think we've got to be very clear. Sanctions, saber rattling, have failed. I think we all know that a military strike, whether by Israel or anybody else, would be a disaster for the region. It would unite Iran in fury. It would not work. Even the US Defense Secretary has said it may delay matters for a year, may. If Iran has her heart set on a nuclear program, she will not be deterred. If she hasn't, then a military strike will encourage her to do so. For all those reasons, it would be a disaster. Therefore, let's be realistic. Let's take the option off the table, try to foster better relations, better engage with Iran, and do what Nixon did to the Chinese, basically in the 60s and 70s, and not deny the reality of Iran's power.
Why do you not accept the argument, though, that if Iran is allowed to continue with its nuclear program untouched or uninhibited, then it will promote some kind of nuclear arms race in that region?
Well, I think we've got to first of all look at the evidence. The latest IAEA report, there is, in my view, no smoking gun. There is no clear substantive evidence of a nuclear weapons program or of a decision to pursue one. So after Iraq, I think we've got to be very, very careful. Circumstantial evidence, I'm afraid, is not good enough. I mean, we went to war in Iraq on a false premise, as it turned out. Before we even think about going down this road, we want to see substantive evidence. And secondly, even if you accept that they're developing a nuclear weapons program, I, for one, do not buy the argument that it's going to lead to some sort of nuclear arms race in the region. There is no evidence to suggest that Iran is any more irrational than any other member of the existing nuclear club. The theory.
What about their rhetoric in the last?
Well, both sides have rhetoric. President Bush's axis of evil, for example, is rhetoric. Russia has come out with rhetoric. Many other countries have come out with rhetoric. What is important is actions, not words. And there is no evidence to suggest that the theory of nuclear deterrence should not adhere to this region as it does to other parts of the world. After all, India and Pakistan have been at war. They showed nuclear restraint. I'm afraid there's only one country in the world that's actually used nuclear weapons in anger.
Israel's recent rhetoric around the option of military action has been at least, if not more aggressive than Iran's. Why are they allowed to do it if Iran's not?
Well, I happen to believe, and I believe in we should show balance in the region. But I do believe, you can understand the Iranian view that there is sort of double standards to a certain extent. Israel have developed nuclear weapons, so we understand. But is not a signatory of the NPT. Iran is a signatory of the NPT, and yet is going through this very, very intense scrutiny. With implied threats as well. And I think we've got to be very careful to show a balance in our approach, which comes back to the original discussion we were having about the need for that balance when discussing the issue generally. Is
it really balanced, though, to allow Iran to arm itself with nuclear weapons?
Well, as I said, we come back to the evidence business. Let's examine the evidence. You point to me the substantive evidence of that. I have failed to see it. Former directors and director generals of the IAEA have said they cannot see the substantive evidence. So I think we have to be very, very careful here. We do not want to make the same mistake we made in Iraq, where on the basis of secret intelligence and circumstantial evidence, we basically went to war on a false premise.
Could we see a rerun of that?
I think there is a danger. The rhetoric is building up. I mean, there is, the annual condemnation of Iran is you get used to it after a while. But this time round, we certainly seem to be ratcheting up the rhetoric, and that worries me. And we're now talking about the human rights records of Iran and the sponsoring of state terrorism overseas. I mean, this is very bad, obviously, but is not the reason for. It cannot justify war. It cannot justify military intervention. So we've got to make sure we keep a check on this, certainly.
Given what happened in Iraq and how it was shown to be founded on a false premise, why are British MPs so keen to keep this option of military action with Iran on the table?
I think that the vast majority of MPs here don't want to make the same mistake twice, but I personally think that they are wrong to view that you keep an option on the table which, in my view, only heightens the tensions and is having no effect whatsoever. And I think that what should happen now, because we need to look forward, and it's no good just taking an option on the table and think that's the solution. I think what we need to do is what the US did in the 60s and 70s with China. In the 1960s, US influence in Asia was on the wane. China was beginning to flex her muscles. President Nixon did not deny the reality of Chinese power. He engaged. The visit took everybody by surprise, but it was the right decision at the time. It was a defining moment. And what the US must do was put behind it its antagonism towards Iran, which sort of defines this crisis. Try to better engage and realize and offer implicit recognition of Iran's status as a regional superpower. And the reason why the US is the elephant in the room here, in my view, is that Israel will not strike unless Washington agrees, for a whole host of reasons, including the fact that there is a question mark over the military capability of Israel to finish the job if it started it.
John Barron, thank you.
Not working, the Iranians have turned their mind against it, but at the same time it's an option that actually, as I say, inflames the situation and makes a peaceful outcome less likely.
Your motion, though, was almost unanimously rejected. Clearly people feel Iran may strike first in the region. Why shouldn't we believe that?
Well, I don't know whether they think Iran could strike first, but they feel that an option should be kept on the table because
I'm joined by John Barron, a British Member of Parliament and the only member of the Conservative Party to vote against taking military action in Libya. John, thanks for speaking to RT. Now, you recently put forward a motion to the House of Parliament urging the government to rule out military action in Iran. You say that move would be counterproductive. Why is that?
Well, I think it's not only naive, but it's illogical. It's naive because the policy, it is, I suppose, in their view, sensible that all options are left on the table, that you don't narrow your options when it comes to negotiations. I take a different view. I think by taking the option off the table, we, in the short term, reduce tensions, which is what we want. There's already talk of, perhaps over the next few months, the Israelis considering a military strike. It reduces the chances short term of a potential accident inflaming a conflict, like, for example, another shooting down of Iran Air 655. But longer term, by taking that option off the table, it, I think, increases the chance of a peaceful outcome and perhaps gives us time to reflect on what is desperately needed here, which is a fresh approach.
But isn't Britain justified in keeping this option on the table, given Iran's defiance and aggressive rhetoric?
The force has clearly failed. The policy of saber rattling and sanctions has not worked. They are yesterday's policies. Iran is not going to be deterred from pursuing its nuclear program. But it's also illogical because we're keeping an option on the table which clearly inflames the situation. People know that it's would be a disaster if we pursued that option of force. It's not